appreciate all of you who dragged yourself here on a Friday with finals looming and beautiful weather outside. So hopefully I will make it well worth your time. This was actually just an extra slide, but this gentleman unicycled, I believe it was from Montreal to Toronto in 5 days. So an example of what we can achieve if we put our mind to unicycling. Anyway, but I am here today to talk about this question of regulating personal transportation devices. And I'm looking at them as a whole class instead of one particular device type. And so you can think of this as the rules of the road for personal transportation devices. If I'm on one, whether I own it myself or I have a shared scooter, whatever else, where can I ride it? How fast can I go? Are there places I can't use it? Where can I park it? All those things that for other vehicle types we usually find in a state vehicle code, like where can you drive, etc. And then with some additional city regulations usually layered on top. And I got the idea for this project because my husband commutes to Caltrain to San Francisco and was telling me how he gets off and they're just all these strange devices. People get off the train and they unfold whatever and he's never seen it before and they wheel off. And I had also at that time known about Kevin Fang's skateboarding dissertation. And I kind of put together some things I'd heard Kevin talking about with respect to that skateboards weren't very well regulated, perhaps not so fairly regulated. And so we put our heads together and came up with this project, which we are doing in collaboration with Ashley Hooper, who is a doctoral candidate at Irvine in planning. And we are funded by the Mineta Transportation Institute, which is at San Jose State. So let me start. I'm going to quickly say what I mean by PTDs, and then turn to just sort of briefly explaining our methods. And we had sort of 2 big research questions, so I'll go through the findings of each of those. And I think usually you mostly take questions at the end, but I don't. If you have a short question along the way, by all means, please ask. So there is no definition out there of personal transportation devices that we could just sort of pick up and say this is the official definition. We are looking at all these small little devices with wheels and that transport usually one person. They can be human-powered or motorized, and they can also be what we might think of as traditional, they've been around a long time, or new, like the things on my husband on Caltrain is seeing that he's never seen before that week. And just to give you a few others, by the way, what is new is actually old. It turns out that e-scooters, which I think lots of us consider very new, have a long history. There was a company in New York, and it was a German New York company, I think, started manufacturing them in 1915. And we have here Amelia Earhart, famed pilot. Apparently she was fond of riding on e-scooters. And over here we have the U.S. Post Office. I can't remember if it was in New York, but they bought scooters with the idea that this would be a faster and more efficient way to deliver the mail in congested city conditions. So again, they've been around a while. Different kinds of people are using them. People have gotten very creative. Kevin, I don't know quite where he found it. He thinks it was taken in Oakland, and we were sort of wondering, what is that device? It's probably motorized. There seems to be a popular genre of motorized drink coolers. You can spend a lot of money on one. They're competitor brands. And then here we have what bills itself as, I believe, the first electric roller skates. And the reason, other than just that it's sort of entertaining to look at pictures like this, is I really want to underscore the point, because it's fundamental to the arguments I'm making. There are so many kinds, and new ones are just popping up constantly. So it's very different from if you have to sort of one device figuring out, okay, how do we regulate it? So we have 2 research questions that motivated this project. The first is, what rules right now are either directly or indirectly regulating personal transportation devices? Right now is when we collected the data, which is already starting to be a little bit out of date because we finished that 6 months or so. So I don't think the big patterns of what I'm going to share with you have changed at all, but certainly individual cities and states and such have amended their regulations. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then the question number 2 is, what should the rules of the road be? What should be the rules about where we can use them? And this question of regulation and what you should or shouldn't do, again, apparently has a long history. This is apparently a picture of Humphrey Bogart and another actor I don't know named Alan Jenkins, who were stopped for speeding on their scooters at Warner Brothers, movie lot. So long history of people being stopped and maybe ticketed for how they're riding these. So research methods, what did we do? For the rules of the road study, I have sort of incredible gratitude to the many students who spent hundreds of hours combing through the regulations. And actually, this is also part of kind of one of the arguments I make. It is almost impossible to find out how you should be riding one of these devices. It's not that people are just all careless and not trying. I mean, we, as I said, hundreds and hundreds of hours. We looked at all 50 states and some U.S. territories. We designed this right after the Puerto Rican disasters and thought it was a good way to remind ourselves that the U.S. territories are part of the United States, since that seemed to be in question at the time. And then 101 cities, which we did our best to select randomly with some sort of strategy to cover different parts of the country, cities of different sizes, some that we thought were probably likely to have a lot more of these devices already, and then others that probably wouldn't, a random suburb in a metro area, that sort of thing. And then 20 university campuses. And we picked those in part because universities are often the first places you see a lot of these things being used en masse, and so we figured that, again, the universities are maybe a little bit ahead of the curve on this. So that was how and I'm going to talk through sort of what we learned once we combed through this, stuck it in spreadsheets, and spent forever trying to analyze it. It was a lot of data to manage. The second thing is we wanted to come up with this model, recommended rules of the road. And so for that, we, of course, used what we learned from our analysis of existing regulations. We did a literature review, kind of the traditional scholarly, but frankly, there's not much literature out there. And then finally, we interviewed 21 experts who represented a wide variety of different perspectives. So everybody for people working for like Bird and the companies that actually have these shared devices, to a pedestrian advocate, bike advocate, somebody who works as an advocate for the interests of the elderly and the disabled, city planners, a municipal attorney, a law professor. We, as much as we could, tried to cover a wide gamut of perspectives. This, by the way, is a folding electric longboard. It's apparently bamboo. That's one of their claims to fame. So, what did we learn about the current rules? And by the way, I like history. This is a picture from 1916. Lady Norman Florence apparently traveled to work on her electric scooter, and she was a suffragette. And I guess her husband apparently gave her her scooter. But what did we learn? Well, the first thing is we learned there is no normal. There is nothing I can tell you like, in general, you're supposed to do this, or in most places, you're not supposed to do that. It is just very confusing. And so there's no normal is probably the optimistic way to describe it. And the less optimistic way is the second phrase I have up there. PTD users operate in a murky regulatory environment with rules often poorly defined, contradictory, or missing. There aren't any. So let me now sort of try and break that out and give you some more concrete examples of what all this means. And let me also see if I can make this bigger so that I can actually read my own text. No. Okay. So first of all, what kinds of things do these rules cover? Again, no one set of rules, sort of covers everything, but when you look across all those 100 and whatever 70 jurisdictions, there are behaviors that the rules say are required. You must wear a helmet or whatever. There are rules that are permitted. So the state or city is explicitly saying you are allowed to ride in the street or whatnot. There are behaviors prohibited. You may not ride in certain locations. And then what we've classified as behaviors that are exempted. So sometimes the states in particular will say things like, you do not have to register your vehicle or device with the state, or you do not have to have a driver's license. So again, and then there are all kinds of sort of details amongst those 4 general categories. There were lots of problems. Wait, let me just see, with what is and isn't defined. So one of the sort of overarching points I made a moment ago is that it's completely unclear what you're supposed to do, because oftentimes you are not regulated. So for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of reading, say, a state motor vehicle code, the way they're set up is first they define different terms, and in this case it's usually a motor vehicle, a bicycle, whatever, that they're going to regulate. So they have a definition describing what it is, and then they follow with rules about how you can and can't use all those different devices. So what we did for every jurisdiction we looked at, we looked at the definition and everything related to pedestrians and motor vehicles and motorists, and then every possible PTD sort of name we could think of. And what we found is basically most of these things are just not regulated, particularly at the state level. The most commonly regulated device was these EPAMs, which is it's a Segway. Essentially, it's a Segway. I don't know if you've all seen them. They're these sort of big things, and you stand on it, and if you lean forward, it moves forward, and if you lean back, it stops. They look quite silly. You'll see tourists on them in San Francisco doing tours of the city. And actually, the manufacturer, Segway, when those came out 15, 20 years ago, made a big push to get the states to change their motor vehicle codes so that these would be allowed, and I'm sure allowed in a way that Segway considered favorable. So in this case, 69% of the states did actually, you could figure out, if I have a Segway, you could figure out it's defined and here's what I should or shouldn't do. 13% of cities did, and 35% of campuses. One thing to keep in mind is the relationship between the states and the cities. So if a state defines a device, there may not be any need for a city to do so, or the city may not even be permitted in some cases to add additional regulations. On the other hand, if a state doesn't define a particular device, then sometimes the city has the latitude to just add whatever it wants on top. Motorized kick scooters, and now this data, by the way, is a little out of date. These numbers will have changed some, but that's what's sort of everywhere that people are all up in arms about or love, depending on your perspective. Only 29% of states explicitly defined and regulated them. Somewhat more cities and somewhat more campuses, but again, only 60% even of college campuses. And it just goes downhill from there. So kick scooters, which are the things your kid maybe rides, but I know our chair of Mexican-American Studies, for example, travels all over campus on a kick scooter. Only 15% of states mentioned those. Same with skateboards. Hoverboards, which you see, zero. 0 states had any specific definition or regulation for a hoverboard. Same with cities, although campuses were sort of stepping up to the plate here, and 65% of campuses had some sort of definition and regulation. So again, just the key thing is, even if you're trying to do the right thing and follow whatever the laws are, there often aren't laws, even if you spend hours hunting through the relevant codes. Yes?
Is there an estimate in the code so that, for example, motorized skateboards would be regulated by the skateboard definition?
So sometimes yes, sometimes no. And actually, my next slide, so thank you, lovely transition, although I'm not talking about skateboards, is that sometimes PTDs, although there's not an explicit, like, here's the definition of a hoverboard, sometimes the definitions for other modes indeed will sort of apply to specific types of PTDs. And this happens most commonly with the definitions of vehicles and the definition of pedestrians. And so here, for example, the blue is vehicle. So, and this is looking at states. So in 20 states, the way they define a vehicle would probably sort of cover any human-powered PTD. So a skateboard or a human-powered kick scooter. The vehicle definition, even more often, 39 states would sort of encompass these Segway-type creatures. And then in 51, yes, so in almost everywhere, there were at least some other kinds of motorized PTDs that could get sort of swept up in the rules for vehicles. So good news, at least there's some instructions on what you're supposed to do. Bad news is do we really want to be regulating a skateboard the same way as a pedestrian? Or do we really think that an electric kick scooter should have the same rules as a truck or other motorized vehicles? Then there was the definition of pedestrian, and in a few states those could encompass what we might think of as human-powered PTDs, kick scooters and all, and sometimes even the EPAMs, the Segways. In the 7 different places, the Segway was not considered a motor vehicle. It was not considered its sort of own thing. It was considered a pedestrian. So now we move along to what I think was sort of and I've been saying this again and again, but it was just bewildering. and not just that it was hard to figure out for one jurisdiction what you should be doing, but it was incredibly inconsistent. And inconsistent in sort of every way we could think about. So, for example, PTDs were often subject to regulations for different modes in ways that didn't make sense. And let's see. So, for example, Segways are regulated as vehicles in Nebraska, but pedestrians in Idaho. Now, why, we don't know, but that's the way it is. Secondly, the regulations about what you could or couldn't do with a specific type of PTD, again, just varied all over the place. So to use electric scooters as an example, there are some states where you are prohibited from riding on the sidewalk. There are some states where you are allowed to be on the sidewalk. It's a choice. And there are some states where you are required to be on the sidewalk. So again, you just have the entire gamut of, you can't, you have to, you have a choice. And then another thing that we found confusing was that an individual city or campus or state would often regulate devices that to us seemed functionally fairly similar in different ways. And actually our own state of California is a nice example of this. So even though I would argue an electric skateboard and a motorized, like the e-scooters, are fairly similar. They have sort of the platforms are kind of roughly the same size, all of that. If you are on an e-scooter, I think you need a driver's license, and you don't if you're on an electric skateboard. You have to wear a helmet on an electric skateboard, but you don't have to wear it on the e-scooter. And there are speed limit regulations for one of them, but not for the other. And I'm forgetting now which it is. So again, these very similar devices. If you're just an average person, you buy one, you borrow your friends, you think you know what you should do because this is like an e-scooter, and I've ridden those. Well, quite likely you're not following the rules. So, and then a last problem from my perspective, now not everybody will agree, but I think these things have tremendous potential to really improve transportation in our communities, whether it's because it's more affordable, it's good in places where it's congested, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of communities just outright ban at least individual types of them. You may not ride a scooter in our city, But then the other thing that's happening is that there's sometimes not an outright ban, but there will be combinations of regulations within one jurisdiction. And if you put them all together, they become a sort of de facto ban. So for example, there are some places that say you cannot ride on the sidewalk. Prohibited, banned, no sidewalk riding. And then they also say you can't ride in a street that has a speed limit above like 30 miles an hour. So imagine your favorite American arterial, lots of lanes, cars traveling 35 miles an hour, and a lovely big sidewalk with nobody on it, not a single pedestrian anywhere to be seen. Well, with the PTD, not only are you not allowed to use the sidewalk, but you're not allowed to use the street either. So you literally cannot travel along that corridor legally because of the way the combination of the different regulations ends up. So what should the rules be? And as I mentioned, we sort of looked at what we had learned from all these other communities, and we put together a draft of what we thought this is what a state should do. This is what the vehicle code should have added into it to regulate PTDs. And then we started doing our interviews. And it was an iterative process. We hadn't exactly planned it, but it worked really well. We'd go off and do 1 or 2 interviews, and then the team would get together and we would talk about it and figure out changes that we wanted to make based on what we had learned from that conversation. And we just kept repeating that through 21 different interviews. So I'm extremely grateful to all the professionals who talked to us. It's so much better now than when we started. And I'm sure it's not perfect, but my hope is that a lot of the kind of overarching principles and at least some of the details could be useful to communities. So once we sort of wanted to start writing the text of what we think these rules of the road should be, we figured out that there were a few key principles that we wanted to use as guides because we thought they would create the most effective kind of fair regulations. So the first of these was that it is essential to protect public safety. And that is the people riding on these devices, the PTD users, but of course everybody else, pedestrians, other people on the sidewalk. So we want to be protecting public safety. At the same time, we believe that PTDs for some people and in some circumstances are an extremely good way to move around, and so people should be permitted to use them. There are some problems. It's clearly a rocky transition, but you know what? Cars kill 40,000 people a year, and we have not seriously in this country said, we'll just ban them. No cars, anywhere. People are dying, just stop. And there are all kinds of other things we allow to happen, and we don't ban even though they do kill people. So while we want to do everything we can to make sure public safety is protected, we don't think just an outright ban because some people will fall off and break a leg or may hit somebody else is a reason to just completely ban them. The challenge is to figure out, as we do with cars and bicycles and all kinds of other things in our country, how we can integrate them in a safe way. Thirdly, we feel that most states have more or less, in cities, they name some specific devices, but that doesn't really seem to work because there are just so many, and new ones seem to be popping up each month. You can hardly expect our states, cities, and campuses like every month to see a new device and rush out and go through the whole rulemaking process to write up rules for a new device. So we think we really needed to find some way of defining a class of devices that would be fairly comprehensive, include most of these things, and would permit new devices as they arrive to hopefully just fit in, and you don't have to remake your regulations every month. And some other advantages of this too are, well, let me stop there. And then finally, we felt very strongly that whatever we did, the rules had to be easy to understand and remember. And we would find ourselves getting excited about all kinds of sort of really micro-detailed rules and then realize, like, wait a minute. Nobody is ever going to remember this. And it's not just the riders who need to understand the rules. You need the police who are enforcing it to understand it. But you also want other people on the sidewalk, drivers, etc., to know what to expect. So it seemed really important to try to, where possible, keep things as simple as possible and sort of intuitive as well. So I'm going to run through 4 of the core elements that we put into this set of model rules of the road. The first is we believe that the states are the appropriate entity to define and have fairly comprehensive rules about how you can ride your PTD. That this should not just be left to all the cities. Like, we don't let every city define motor vehicle or bicycle. You know, that similarly here, the state is this appropriate place. Also because, you know, if you ride from Berkeley to Oakland on your electric whatever, that lovely bamboo electric longboard, you know, you want to sort of know that things are pretty much the same when you cross whatever the dividing line is around College and Claremont, going to Oakland. But we also do recognize that there are, you know, unique conditions. Some places are really crowded. Some places have, as I mentioned, huge sidewalks with absolutely no one on them. So the way we structured our rules is we have sort of what you can and can't do, and then we give local jurisdictions the opportunity to add more strict rules if local conditions necessitate that to protect other people's freedom of travel and public safety. We also recommend regulating, as I've mentioned, PTDs as a class. And so here is the definition that we came up with. So a personal transportation device, PTD, is a device designed to transport only one person in a standing or seated position where the rider is not enclosed, that it is be operated and propelled using human, electric, or motor power, and it is not greater than 24 inches wide and 42 inches long. Let me just explain a few things about this. The size, we looked, and in the report that's going to be coming out in a few weeks, we sort of inventoried dozens and dozens of these devices, and we looked at their weight, their dimensions, their operating speed, the range, if that was a matter. And we realized that almost all of them sort of, except for a few of the very longest longboard kinds of things, were certainly shorter than 42 inches. And we wanted something that we thought could go on the sidewalk, realistically. So if it's incredibly long, you're going to trip people. And we had 24 inches wide with the idea that other people should be able to, pass. You don't want to hog up the entire sidewalk with your device. And also 24 inches is frankly not that much wider than a lot of standing adults. So we weren't really giving a footprint that was actually a whole lot bigger than just a person walking down the sidewalk, especially maybe carrying some bags or whatnot. We felt strongly, although a lot of our interviewees disagreed, that your mode of propulsion wasn't really key to how you should behave, the rules that should apply to you. We've lumped together human-powered and motorized. First of all, if you're a good skateboarder, you can go really fast with human power. So it's not as if you can't go fast enough to cause problems with some of these devices under your own power. And also, you don't have to ride an e-scooter at 18 miles an hour if that's the functional capacity. And I think that we actually found cars a really good example here. Imagine like a really small smart car, kind of the two-seater, maybe only goes 35 miles an hour, and a Ferrari. They obviously have incredibly different functional capabilities, right? But we don't have the Ferrari rules and the smart car rules. And even comparing cars and trucks, your huge 18-wheeler, except for not being able to travel in some locations and having slightly different speed limits, again, the rules are basically the same, whether you're the Ferrari, the little smart car, or the truck. As the operator, the driver, it is your responsibility to know the rules and to operate in a way that's safe. And we think that if that, and I know it's not perfect for motor vehicles, but if that's sort of appropriate for motor vehicles, why wouldn't it be appropriate for these sorts of devices as well? And we thought about the enclosure. There are starting to be some things that you'll see out there that have these little kind of enclosures. We felt that potentially that would block your vision and also maybe make you bulkier on the sidewalk. So for now, we've sort of excluded that, although I think that's certainly something that would be open to debate depending on what other vehicles get designed. We say that if it's a device that moves a single person that is basically bigger than the dimensions we've given, you're a bicycle. And you just follow all the rules and regulations for bicycles. And we wanted to be sure that we didn't leave certain types of vehicles unregulated, partly because it's confusing if you have one, but also because there's then a strong incentive to device manufacturers. Like, well, if I just make it 2 inches longer, it won't be a PTD, and now there won't be any rules at all for my riders, or something like that. And there is some evidence that the manufacturers often do try and get around rules by doing things like that. So here, if you're not a PTD, you're a bike, for the most part. And we do specifically exclude bikes and electric bikes, and say that if you are on a mobility device, and you are a person with a mobility-related disability, so like a power wheelchair, for example, would always probably be wider than 24 inches. Well, we're not including that use case of someone with a mobility disability in a device that person is using. Core elements, the next thing is, where appropriate, craft PTD rules to mimic bicycle rules. And this really came back partly to just simplicity. It's easier to remember one set of rules than many. So for example, helmets, we didn't wade into should we all wear helmets or not. Personally, I think we should, but that's Asha's opinion. But we basically said whatever the state's rules are for bicyclists and helmets, it applies to PTDs as well. And there were a few other cases where it just made sense to just do whatever is done for bicyclists. The last thing I'll talk through here is, and this was by far the most controversial thing, and in addition, by the way, to that 21 formal interviews we did, I have talked with dozens of people at conferences, at dinner parties. It's a topic that people tend to find interesting, and I'm always been sort of trying to learn new things. So just, in chatting with people, by far the most kind of controversial thing was, should these devices be on the sidewalk or not? And after a lot of kind of back and forth and thought, we came down with the recommendation that the riders should be able to choose whether to ride in the street or in the sidewalk, but that in both cases, but the sidewalk is what matters most, they have to do so in a sort of cautious way that will protect everybody's safety and the freedom for other people to use the sidewalks as well. So let me just give you part of, this was actually a longer section, like what do you do when you're on a sidewalk? But this is a lot of the core of what I was talking about. So while operating on sidewalks and in crosswalks, PTD operators shall slow when approaching and overtaking pedestrians, PTD operators, and other sidewalk users. Maintain a distance of at least 2 feet from pedestrians, PTD operators, and other sidewalk users. So in other words, if you're passing somebody, you shouldn't be like scooting by 2 inches from them, which, makes it much more likely you'll accidentally hit each other. And it's also just, as a pedestrian, I don't like it when people whoosh by me right next to me on the sidewalk. So you have to give some space. You also must make an audible signal if you're overtaking somebody so that people know you're coming up behind them, sort of like bicyclists ring their bell. Although we didn't, by the way, say like you have to use a bell, because we figured for some devices that makes sense. Like a scooter, you could have a little bell on it. But if I'm on a skateboard, am I going to carry a bell in my hand? Probably not. So just let people say on your left or whatever they want to do. Slow to a walking speed when approaching and entering intersections. This is the issue that those of you who sort of think about bicycling a lot are probably aware of. It's quite dangerous for the bicyclist to shoot off the sidewalk at, even slow bicycling speed into a crosswalk, because most motor vehicle drivers are not expecting anyone to come that fast. They're sort of expecting a pedestrian speed person to come off. And so there's a particularly great danger that like a right-turning vehicle will hit you if you just shoot off. And so for everybody's safety, we felt that it was reasonable that once you're actually in a crosswalk, and you would have to slow down to walking speed. Finally, we say in E, dismount if conditions make it impossible to sort of abide by these rules or otherwise respect pedestrians' right of ways. And actually, I realized this should say, I think, to B. So basically, if it's so crowded that you can't stay at least 2 feet away from other people on the sidewalk, you shouldn't be riding. Just get off or move yourself into the street or do something else. And so I'll just pause there with the sort of formal, here's what we found, mention we have a couple of smaller pieces that we've written along the way that are already published on MTI's website. They're free PDFs to download. And we have been working on our Opus, this larger report, which was literally being sort of, copy editing's done and it's being laid out. So I would think within a week or two, we'll probably have that available. Another thing that I'm hoping will be useful, we are putting up sort of as a side thing, the Excel files that we put together of all the regulations. So if you want to know what Boise, Idaho is doing, at least when we looked, if that was one of our cities, you can go. Or if you want to have a personal, really great interest in, I don't know, unicycles, which, by the way, I think are pretty much unregulated, but you could see everything we found about unicycles by going through that information. And then what I would end with, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have, but to me, one of the things this whole project emphasizes is, I think for a long time in the US, we had this view of streets as places where you had cars and pedestrians. And a few bikes, but we didn't really deal with them very well. So basically everything was sort of set up for cars and pedestrians, and you had these 2 sets of rules. And it was this very black and white situation. And just, we even had trouble bounding PTDs. Like, well, what if you do have a little cover? What if it's not much bigger than what we've described, but you have 2 people on it? How are these all different from bicycles? And we see now with e-bikes and bikes, and I've seen these little now like mini motorized bikes. The wheels are about this big and they're only about that long. Is that a PTD? Is it a bicycle? And even with cars, we're starting to see a lot more very small vehicles or low-speed vehicles. I feel like we probably, maybe not just for PTDs, but more generally, need to start thinking of this sort of continuum of vehicles, and that what really matters is more how you operate, and that our rules not be so linked to very specific descriptions of what a vehicle is. So with that, I would love comments, questions, or it's almost 5 o'clock and you may all want to get out and catch the last bit of sun for the day. We did, yes, and I didn't show you all the rules because I already talked long enough as it is. We thought about that one too. We actually did it and wrote up a separate little study where we went around downtown San Jose and photographed 400 or 500 parked scooters and then analyzed, like, are they on their side? Are they upright? Are they blocking, an ADA facility or not? We found most of them were actually messy to look at, but not genuinely blocking access. That was San Jose. I don't claim it's the same everywhere. We also didn't want, we feel like in a lot of communities, and the way the sidewalks are designed and such, there is place you can park these devices where frankly it's not going to be interfering with people. So like, especially in like downtown commercial areas, you often have this street furniture zone where there are signs and maybe newspaper boxes that are still holding on, even though nobody much reads newspapers anymore, and benches, and kind of in that space, adding some parked devices should really not be substantially changing people's ability to walk and otherwise travel. I do think it's a different question that we did not weigh into at all as to if a private company like Bird is having their vehicles parked, maybe the city wants to charge a fee or something. Somebody's making a profit off public space. But if it's just your own vehicle, then we think, and we initially thought, well, we'll say that the device has to be upright, because a lot of the times when we see problem devices, it's the scooters that have fallen over, and then the stem is blocking the sidewalk. But then we started, one of our interviewees was like, but what's an upright skateboard? It's like, oh, well, I mean, is that, the way we ride it, or do you have to tip it up? And we basically just fell back on kind of, you can't park in a way that blocks people's access. And then we did say that cities and areas where there was particular need could further limit parking. Yes?
Yeah, there's one thing, it seems like there's a common agreement or regulation that they can't go faster than 20-some-odd miles per hour.
We did not find that. In fact, very few places that we checked, and obviously we didn't look at every city in the U.S., we only looked at 101, most of them didn't have speed limits. Some did.
I don't know if it's just something that's on the books with manufacturers. When people have something going on, I ask, what's its maximum speed that you always say? You're always giving them something.
Right. Our thought is that if someone's riding in the street, they should be subject to whatever the speed limit is in the street. And I know a lot of cities are requiring the shared scooter companies to sort of use software to limit speeds. To some extent, that seems like, okay, maybe, but it doesn't deal with all the privately owned vehicles. So I still feel like people need to have a sort of a sense of responsibility, like if I'm riding this device, this is what I can and can't do. And another thing is just like a Ferrari can drive, I don't know, I'm not really a car person, 200 miles an hour. We don't say you can't drive a Ferrari because it could go 200 miles an hour. We just say, like everybody else, in residential streets, you're going 25, and in theory on the highway, 65 or 70. So kind of the functional possible maximum device actually just seemed irrelevant to us. I know that not everybody agrees with that point. Yes?
Given that it seems like there's a policy window of opportunity here, I'm curious if you have other thoughts beyond like rethinking the spectrum of vehicles about what else might get done at the same time. Like I'm thinking about bikes.
Yeah,
What
and
else would you do?
so it's a slippery slope. I mean, once we got into this, I found myself thinking, oh, let's look at bike rules too, and then it was just like we only had so many hours in budget, and we had to draw the line somewhere. But I agree that I don't know if this will happen. I think looking comprehensively at all types of vehicles would probably make sense. We started creating this whole set of rules like mostly in the teens and 20s. And since then, obviously, vehicles have changed, cities have changed, road technology has changed, and we've adjusted the rules, but a lot of it is kind of what got set up in, 1925 or whatever. And maybe in 100 years things have changed enough that we should rethink it. But then that also bleeds into the physical sort of separation of space. Like, should we still have a roadway with lanes in each direction and sidewalks? Should we have more sort of naked streets, as the Dutch and the British have started sometimes doing, where it's just a free-for-all for everybody in one shared space? So I get a little overwhelmed trying to understand, like, how do you break off the right bite-sized pieces that aren't unnecessarily limiting? But are still doable.
Seems like in Europe there'll be a lot of these devices around there. Have you seen what the Europeans are doing?
No, we have a long section of additional research we'd love to see somebody do, and one of them is looking in particular at Japan and China and Europe and countries that don't necessarily have a lot of these devices, but that have far more experience in the US in bicycles and pedestrians sharing spaces, and to see what we can learn from how that is negotiated, and can some of those same principles apply well to pedestrians and PTDs sharing space. Yes.
So a little bit vague, and I'm sorry if you can't cover this at the beginning. I wondered if you could talk a little more about your idea of minimizing classes.
Mm-hmm.
I assume this probably has a lot to do with your discussion around should these things be going on sidewalks.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why not just consider them bicycles effectively in an effort to minimize classes?
So you're right. Simple to understand. That would be the best we could do. So I appreciate that. But bicycles are very limited in a lot. Now, some states, for example, allow bikes to be ridden on the sidewalk. Actually, a lot. You'll be surprised. But we were trying to give PTD riders some additional rights that bicyclists don't have. And also there are some differences, like bikes, and I didn't show you all of our regulations, but bikes sort of by law have to have reflectors. We thought about that, and we said, well, you need to have either the device or the rider needs to have some lighting and reflectors at night. Again, because if it's something like a scooter, you can maybe just build it in, but if I'm on those electric skates, you know, I'm probably not going to have the lights in my feet. You know, maybe I wear something in a case like that. But it's a very fair question you ask, and I don't know, maybe that's how some communities will end up. You also then, for example, kids. Kids was another really confusing thing. If my 8-year-old son is on a kick scooter, like, should he have to ride in the street? You know, and where do you draw the line between who's a child for these purposes and maybe is allowed on the sidewalk if others aren't? So, yeah.
Thank you, Asha. So here's a gift from ITS.
Oh, very kind
For
of you.
anyone who has any questions, please stay here and talk with Asha. And so I think that's all. Thank you again.